From Russia with Love is the second film in the long-running spy franchise. It was released in 1963, just 1 year after Dr. No, and Eon Productions chose this specific story to put to film because at the time it was reported as President John F. Kennedy's favorite novel. At its core, From Russia with Love is a revenge story, with criminal organization Spectre seeking to avenge the death of one of its operatives, Dr. No. You could call this a direct sequel. In future Bond films, pretty much each installment stands by its own, but this one has little things that they carried over from Dr. No. We even see Bond briefly hooking up with Sylvia Trench, who was a love interest from Dr. No, and trust me, their rendezvous doesn't last too long here. From Russia with Love is a more complicated story than Dr. No. There are a couple of subplots that interfere with the main story, but all you really need to know is that Spectre is trying to get their hands on a highly coveted device called Elector Decoder, which both the Russian and British governments are trying to go after as well. In order to get their hands on it, Spectre sets up Bond as kind of their patsy, sending Red Grant to go after him as a double agent so that in the final act, he can get his hands on the Elector Decoder and sell it to the Russian government. From Russia with Love start several long-running Bond traditions, such as the psychedelic opening title, the neat little gadgets that Bond uses out in the field, and a couple of action sequences, namely a helicopter action sequence and a train sequence that get repeated in future Bond films. Since the plot is a little confusing in this film, I'll go over kind of the main core elements. First of all, we're going to start with the villains. At the top of the Spectre organization is number 1, who in later films we find out is named Ernst Blofeld. He is one of the more memorable Bond villains, one of the key villains, and in this one, we only see the back of his head, for the next couple of films actually, until they reveal him. In this film, he's actually played by Anthony Dawson, who is also in Dr. No. He played Professor Dent. Blofeld is the mad scientist you've seen parodied in a number of times in things like Inspector Gadget, and in the Austin Powers films more obviously. They usually portray him in his chair, and he's usually petting his cat. This interpretation of the character would be carried over into future Bond films, and is what makes him one of the more key and more interesting Bond villains, even though in every film he's played by a different actor. There's Kronstein, a world-renowned chess player who is kind of like the mastermind behind the whole operation. He's a very minor role, and like Dr. No, he's very calculating and reserved. For some reason, when I think of Kronstein, even though he's a minor villain in this, and he only shows up in this one film, I always think of him when I think of the real classic early Bond villains. There's Red Grant, who's played in this film by Robert Shaw, and he gets recruited by Spectre early on to act as a double agent so that he can kind of go after Bond and steal the decoder when he's least expecting it. He's a really interesting villain in that Grant pretty much stays in the shadows for most of the films. His main purpose is to move Bond further along in his adventure, so whenever Bond's in trouble, there's Grant in the shadows helping him out. There's some dramatic irony going on because as the audience, we know that Grant's the villain. We know what his purpose is. So when he finally confronts Bond for the first time on the train, it's really suspenseful. Their best scene together, in my opinion, is the scene on the train. And when we're first introduced to Grant, the lady who recruits him, Rosa Klebb, who we'll talk about in a minute, punches him in the stomach with brass knuckles to test his endurance. And Grant doesn't even flinch. While Kronstein is the brains of the operation, Grant is definitely the brawn here. The thing with Grant is he doesn't have much of a personality and he doesn't say very much. And since he has very little interaction with Bond, he doesn't really stand out in the grand scheme of things. Then there's Rosa Klebb, who is one of my favorite Bond villains, definitely my favorite villain in the film. Even though she's a secondary villain, she has the biggest screen presence. She's the boss from hell. She's grouchy, abusive, and a strong female character that's both assertive and terrifying. Her most memorable scene is during the film's climax, where she has one last chance to steal the Lecter from Bond, and when they actually fight, she attacks him with a shoe that's equipped with a poisonous spike. It's a little ridiculous, but it adds to the evilness of her character. This is the first film to introduce Desmond Llewellyn as Q, the head of Q Branch, who always gives Bond his nifty gadgets in each film. Llewellyn has a long history with the franchise because he's been in more Bond films than any other actor. When series veterans Bernard Lee and Lois Maxwell left the series, Llewellyn stayed on as the head of Q Branch, playing Q all the way up until 1999's The World Is Not Enough, the Brosnan era. That's dedication for you. He's underplayed in this film. He doesn't really have a lot to do, and he just kind of comes on and gives Bond his gadgets, but later on he becomes one of the true staples of the series. Everyone looks forward to seeing him. The leading Bond girl this time is Tatiana Romanova, played by Daniela Bianchi. She gets recruited by Spectre under false pretenses to help them track down the Lecter. Although she becomes Bond's main love interest in the film, Bond eventually becomes suspicious of her and at one point hits her, which makes his character a little less likable. Also, when they're both introduced, Tatiana is just waiting in bed for him, so it adds to the series' sleaziness overall. Incidentally, this is the scene that filmmakers use whenever they're trying to cast a prospective Bond or Bond girl in later entries. As the second film in the series, it holds up surprisingly well. The story is more convoluted, there's a lot more at stake in this one, but with all of the colorful characters, the great action scenes, and some really effective elements of suspense, this marks another really strong entry in the series. If you were a fan of Dr. No, then you definitely have to watch this. It's like required viewing. Although it wouldn't be until the next film, Goldfinger, where James Bond really got propelled into the status of a cultural icon. Hey, as always, thanks for watching my videos, and if you liked it, subscribe for more awesome content. Thanks.